Most people believe that the ego is their enemy, that it needs to be eliminated, silenced, destroyed. This narrative has gained strength in pop culture, on social media, in self-help speeches that demonize the ego as the root of all suffering. But what if this view is fundamentally misguided? What if the real problem is not the ego itself, but a corrupted version of it, shaped by rejection, shame, and the desperate need to be accepted in a world that values appearance more than authenticity? Carl Gustav Jung, one of the greatest names in depth psychology, was emphatic in stating, "The ego is necessary. It is the conscious structure of our identity. It is what allows us to say, 'I am,' and build a narrative of who we are in the world. Without the ego, there is no consciousness. The problem arises when this ego ceases to fulfill its original function, being an ambassador of the self, and transforms into a tyrant that rules the personality with an iron fist, obsessed with control, image, and external validation. In this state, the individual does not live. They play a role. They perform a character to please others, to fit in, to protect themselves. And this constant performance has a devastating cost: chronic emotional fatigue, a sense of emptiness, identity crises, self-sabotage, and a deep disconnection from one's own essence. Jung called this phenomenon ego inflation, a state in which consciousness identifies in a pathological way with the masks it has created, losing contact with the more authentic parts of being. Worse still, this inflated ego does not operate alone. It acts through complexes, unconscious psychic structures laden with emotions that hijack the personality in specific situations. This is why an apparently mature person can act like a resentful child in the face of criticism, or a confident professional can become a tyrant when their authority is questioned. It is the ego complexes taking control, distorting perceptions, manipulating reactions, and sabotaging relationships and opportunities. What Jung proposed then was not the destruction of the ego, but its transformation. He believed that the ego needed to be reconnected to the self, the organizing center of the psyche, the deep source of authenticity and inner wholeness. This reconnection is not a quick or superficial process. It is a psychic journey, a course of self-observation, confrontation, and reintegration. And only when the ego returns to occupy its rightful place as a servant, not a sovereign, does the individual begin to experience what Jung called authentic authority, a silent inner power that does not need to prove itself to exist. This video is a deep dive into this process, a study of Jung's work on the ego, drawn from his densest and most transformative analyses, such as the relations between the ego and the unconscious and Aion, researches into the phenomenology of the self. Throughout this course, you will understand why your ego acts as it does, how it was shaped to survive rather than to live, and how you can reclaim the central role of your consciousness without falling into the traps of narcissism or false humility. The confusion between a healthy ego and an inflated ego is one of the greatest psychological tragedies of the modern era. In a world where self-esteem is often confused with vanity and authenticity is mistaken for self-promotion, the line between a balanced conscious identity and an inflated ego becomes almost invisible. Carl Jung was one of the first to realize that the ego, although often treated as a villain, is actually an essential but fragile psychic structure. And when this structure is shaped by fear, rejection, and the compulsive need for approval, it transforms into an armor that suffocates the soul. A healthy ego is, above all, functional. It serves as a center for organizing consciousness, allowing the individual to navigate the world, make decisions, set boundaries, and maintain a coherent sense of identity. Jung did not propose that the ego be eliminated, but that it be educated. A healthy ego does not need to shout to be heard, does not need to inflate itself for protection, nor cling to labels to exist. It knows it is not the whole, but a part, and therefore is capable of dialoguing with the other dimensions of the psyche, especially with the self. In contrast, the inflated ego is a caricature of itself. It arises as a response to pain and trauma, a defensive construction created to endure an environment that did not embrace the true essence of the individual. It is the ego that learns early on that showing who one truly is means being punished, rejected, humiliated, or abandoned. So it adapts. It creates characters. It assumes roles. It develops social masks that protect it, but which over time imprison it. And the more these masks are applauded by society, the harder it becomes to abandon them. The inflated ego becomes addicted to validation. It becomes dependent on the external gaze to exist. Its existence revolves around maintaining an idealized image: successful, admired, intelligent, spiritual, irreproachable. But behind the image lies insecurity, fear of exposure, and a growing disconnection from the inner world. Jung described this state as a form of possession. The ego takes the place of the self and tries to control everything. It does not trust anything that cannot be managed by reason, status, or manipulation. This is the fatal error of superficial psychology: to believe that the problem lies in the size of the ego, when in fact the problem lies in the blind identification with it. A person with an inflated ego is not necessarily confident. Often, they are in constant vigilance, fearing any situation that threatens their self-image. And any criticism, any rejection, any failure, no matter how small, is felt as an existential collapse. Because the inflated ego does not allow for failures, it does not tolerate imperfections, it needs to be perfect, or it crumbles. On the other hand, the healthy ego tolerates ambiguity. It can recognize limitations without feeling destroyed. It can laugh at itself. It can change its mind. It can admit it is wrong, because its identity is not glued to an ideal, but connected to something deeper and more stable: the self. This distinction between a healthy ego and an inflated ego is more than theoretical. It is vital for any real process of self-knowledge. Because while the inflated ego lives to maintain an illusory narrative, the healthy ego is capable of making space for the truth, even if it hurts, even if it costs status, even if it forces one to abandon everything they once believed they were. But what happens when this inflated ego begins to dominate the personality completely? When it starts to control your reactions, your relationships, your most intimate decisions? That is where we enter an even more dangerous territory, that of egoic possession. And that is exactly what we will discuss in the next part. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. The idea that you can be possessed by your own ego may sound absurd at first glance. After all, who else would you be, if not that I that automatically responds to the stimuli of the world? But for Jung, this question reveals precisely the problem. The ego was conceived to be just a part of the human psychic apparatus, a bridge between the internal and external world, an interface of consciousness. However, when this ego completely identifies with social roles, with the desires of the environment, with the quest for recognition, it ceases to be a mediator and transforms into a dictator. In this state, you no longer have an ego. The ego has you. This is what Jung called ego possession, a condition in which consciousness is so absorbed in the image it has constructed for itself that it can no longer distinguish where the performance ends and where being begins. The person is no longer living. They are maintaining a facade, and the more successful they are at this, the harder it will be to perceive their own imprisonment. Because on the outside, everything seems to be functioning: career, social media, relationships, but inside, an uncomfortable silence reigns, a sense of disconnection with something essential. Ego possession is the perfect prison. It has no bars, no lock, no executioner. What imprisons is the very image you believe you need to uphold, to deserve to exist. And this prison is maintained not by external forces, but by your own identification with it. You have become what you learned you needed to be loved, accepted, valued. The problem is that in becoming this image, you had to abandon whole parts of yourself, your vulnerability, your authentic desires, your spontaneous creativity, your imperfect humanity. The possessed ego feeds on constant vigilance. It needs you to always be aware of how you are perceived, of the narrative you are conveying. This consumes a colossal amount of psychic energy. And the result is chronic fatigue, physical, emotional, and existential. Not the kind of fatigue that can be resolved with a night's sleep, but that which arises from the disconnection with the vital center of your psyche. As Jung wrote in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, the inflation of the ego is always accompanied by a loss of contact with the unconscious. The ego expands as if it were the whole, and with that, it breaks its connection with the self. This rupture is the true danger, because the ego, when cut off from the self, loses its internal compass. It begins to operate on autopilot, reacting compulsively to any threat to its image. Criticism becomes personal attacks. Failures become tragedies. Divergent opinions become affronts. The possessed ego is always at war, an invisible war to protect an ideal self that was never real. And the most ironic thing is that this ego that fights so hard to keep the image under control is precisely what makes us more fragile. Because the more you identify with a fixed role, the intelligent one, the successful one, the spiritual one, the strong one, the more vulnerable you become to anything that challenges that narrative. And any small crack is experienced as an existential threat. It is not the self that is being attacked. It is the mask. But since you have forgotten that you are wearing one, the pain is real. To escape this state of possession, it is not enough to want to be authentic. It is necessary first to understand how this possession is structured, how it manifests in daily life. And this is where one of Jung's most sophisticated contributions comes in, the theory of ego complexes. They take control when you least expect it, when you feel criticized, rejected, exposed, or out of control. They form entire subpersonalities within you, sabotaging your freedom to act with awareness. In the next part, we will dive into this dark and fascinating territory, the ego complexes, because understanding how they operate is the first step to regaining control of your psyche. Have you ever found yourself reacting excessively to a trivial criticism, as if your entire identity were being called into question? Or perhaps you've noticed that in certain situations you simply disappear, and a more insecure, aggressive, or submissive version of yourself takes control of your behavior. In those moments, you might even think, "I don't know what came over me." The truth is that what came over you has a name, and Jung referred to it as ego complexes. Complexes are autonomous subpersonalities formed by unintegrated emotional experiences. They are pieces of your psyche that, although unconscious, possess energy, purpose, and even a kind of identity of their own. They are not just personality traits, they are psychological entities that live within you and take control when certain triggers are activated. And when that happens, you literally cease to be who you are and become a character created by pain, shame, fear, or the need to protect yourself. Carl Jung was a pioneer in stating that we do not have complexes, complexes have us. This seemingly perplexing statement reveals a profound truth. You can go your entire life believing you are a stable and rational person, when in fact you are being manipulated by dissociated fragments of your own psyche. And the ego, when inflated or poorly structured, becomes the perfect ground for these complexes to operate without resistance. Imagine someone who, when criticized, reacts with disproportionate fury. That is not the healthy ego responding. It is an activated inferiority complex. An old wound, perhaps from childhood, where this person learned that being criticized meant being rejected, humiliated, excluded. The complex acts like hidden software, commanding automatic, repetitive, and intense reactions. And the worst part, the more repressed it is, the more powerful it becomes. Because the unconscious does not disappear. It merely waits for the right moment to manifest. Another common example, someone extremely competent at work, but who sabotages themselves just as they are about to be promoted. In this case, the complex may stem from unconscious beliefs of unworthiness or fear of being exposed and failing. These patterns originate from significant experiences, often traumatic, that were never understood or emotionally processed. And the ego, instead of integrating these experiences, prefers to repress them. The result, the complex strengthens in the shadows. These complexes are not mere isolated dysfunctions. They create internal systems that operate as parallel identities. You may be a kind and balanced person most of the time, but turn into someone cold, reactive, or submissive when faced with emotional threat. And this is not hypocrisy. It is psychic fragmentation. It is proof that your ego is not in control. It has been hijacked by parts of you that have been exiled in the unconscious, yet still cry out for expression. For Jung, the key is not to destroy these complexes, but to bring them to light. Observe their manifestations, recognize their triggers, name the internal voices that dominate your mind at certain moments. It is only through this awareness that it becomes possible to reintegrate these parts and restore the autonomy of the ego in the face of unconscious forces. As he writes in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, the autonomous complex is like a little demon within the psyche. It takes control in critical moments, making us act against our own conscious will. These demons do not need to be exorcised, they need to be understood. And this is where true transformation begins. But merely identifying the complexes is not enough. The next step is to learn to recognize them at the moment they manifest, without merging with them. Because between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies your power. In the next part, we will explore exactly this: how to stop reacting on autopilot and start observing, with presence and clarity, when your ego is about to be possessed again. It is the first practical step to regain control of your life. Self-sabotage is not a character flaw. It is also not laziness, lack of discipline, or low self-esteem, as many still believe. In fact, self-sabotage is a sophisticated psychic strategy, developed by an ego that desperately tries to maintain control, even if that control costs you your happiness, your evolution, and your true potential. To understand this, we need to return to the original function of the ego, to protect the integrity of consciousness. The ego was born to ensure your survival, not to make you happy. It learned to anticipate dangers, avoid rejections, and conform to expectations. And in hostile environments, such as dysfunctional families, oppressive school systems, or societies that punish authenticity, this ego becomes rigid, defensive, and paranoid. It begins to confuse vulnerability with threat, change with risk, growth with danger. And so, even when you try to break free, it is the ego itself that sabotages. You decide to start a project you love and suddenly procrastinate. You try to build a healthy relationship and emotionally shut down. You receive an opportunity for growth and feel an inexplicable fear. This is not bad luck or coincidence. It is the ego trying to keep you in familiar territory, because the new, the unknown, the authentic represent a threat to the image it has spent years constructing. And this is where the ego complexes come into play. When a situation activates an old wound, the ego does not allow consciousness to deal with it maturely. It activates a complex. And this complex, in turn, takes control and drives the sabotage. But the most insidious part is that this occurs under the guise of logic. You believe you are being rational by giving up, withdrawing, avoiding, but in reality, you are merely obeying unconscious patterns of self-protection. Carl Jung described this process with almost surgical precision. For him, the ego, when disconnected from the self, can no longer distinguish what is real from what is projection. It begins to operate in a mode of symbolic survival where maintaining self-image is more important than living truthfully. And because of this, every step toward your authenticity will automatically be seen as a threat and sabotaged before it can even solidify. See how this works. If you have spent your life trying to please others to be accepted, your ego has built itself around the image of a good, helpful, easy-to-deal-with person. Any attempt to set boundaries, say no, or prioritize your needs will feel like a betrayal of your very identity. The result? You backtrack, give in, erase yourself, and then blame yourself for not being able to stand your ground. This is not weakness. It is the complex acting to protect the mask. Or think of someone who grew up hearing they were not good enough. Even as an adult, with real achievements, this inferiority complex continues to operate behind the scenes. Every time an opportunity for prominence arises, the ego goes into alarm mode. What if you fail? What if they discover you are a fraud? The answer? Self-sabotage. You procrastinate, distract yourself, get sick, all to avoid the risk of confirming that old unconscious belief. Once again, the complex wins, the self loses. And what is the cost of all this? A half-lived life, relationships that do not evolve, potentials that never come to fruition, and worse, a chronic feeling of frustration that disguises itself as fatigue, anxiety, or even cynicism. You start to believe that this is just who I am, but it is not. This is merely the you dominated by a poorly oriented ego, which confuses protection with imprisonment. The way to break this cycle is not through brute force. It is not about defeating the ego, but about understanding it, about observing clearly when these dynamics are happening, and gradually rebuilding the relationship between the ego and the self. Self-sabotage ceases when the ego stops acting as an internal enemy and begins to serve as a conscious ally of your wholeness. But how to do this? How to develop this refined perception that allows you to recognize in the heat of the moment that you are being hijacked by unconscious patterns? And even more, how to act with freedom even in the face of these automatic impulses. In the next part, we will delve into the 3 levels of true ego mastery, according to Carl Jung. A process that goes far beyond superficial self-help and requires courage, presence, and maturity. If you want to stop being a hostage to your psyche and take command of your own life, that is where we begin. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Mastering the ego in the sense proposed by Carl Jung does not mean destroying it, repressing its impulses, or living in a false idea of spiritual purity. Quite the opposite. Jung believed that the ego needs to be strengthened, but not inflated. It needs to be educated, refined, and, most importantly, reconnected to the deep center of the psyche, the self. When the ego serves the self, it stops acting as a tyrant and begins to fulfill its true role, being the conscious mediator between the external world and inner reality. But this transformation does not happen overnight. It requires a process of psychological maturation that Jung called individuation. The path through which the individual becomes truly themselves, integrating all parts of their psyche, including those that were previously rejected, unconscious, or repressed. Within this journey, the mastery of the ego occurs in three fundamental stages. First stage, recognizing ego possession. This is the initial awakening. It is when the individual begins to realize that many of their attitudes, emotional reactions, and decisions are not made by a free consciousness, but by automatic patterns, complexes, social masks, and ancestral fears. This stage is deeply uncomfortable, as it requires the courage to admit that you are not in control, and perhaps never have been. It is when you start to see, with brutal honesty, the moments when you acted merely to please, protect yourself, or maintain an image. Here, crucial questions arise. Who is making this decision, me or an old trauma? Am I reacting with maturity or being controlled by a childish complex? This type of self-questioning initiates the collapse of egoic illusions. The ego begins to realize that it is not the sovereign king of the psyche, but rather a poorly trained employee who usurped the throne in the absence of a true center. Second stage, observing without identifying. This is the turning point. Once you recognize the acting complexes, the next step is to develop the ability to witness these internal movements without merging with them. Instead of saying, "I am angry," you start to say, "There is anger in me now." Instead of asserting, "I am a failure," you see that this is just a thought, often inherited, conditioned, and not even true. This stage is profoundly transformative because you begin to experience what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold two opposites in consciousness, the ego and the unconscious. You do not deny your anger, pain, or fears, but you also do not allow them to define you. You observe them, feel them, and learn from them. Here, the ego begins to be repositioned, no longer as the center of the psyche, but as its spokesperson, its articulator, its representative in reality. Third stage, integrating the ego with the self. In the final stage, the ego bows before the self, not as an act of submission, but of cooperation. It understands that there is something greater, deeper, and wiser within you. From there, it begins to act as an ambassador of this inner truth in the world. Its actions cease to be motivated by fear, lack, or compulsion, and become authentic expressions of your wholeness. Jung describes this state as authentic authority, a type of power that does not need to be defended because it does not depend on image, status, or control. It is a silent power, emanating from the alignment between ego and self. The person who reaches this stage is not perfect, enlightened, or above good and evil. They remain human, but are now guided by an internal compass, not by survival mechanisms. This three-stage process is not linear. It is cyclical, deep, and often painful. It requires vigilance, brutal honesty, and a continuous willingness to face one's own inner demons. But the result is a freedom that cannot be bought, taught, or imitated. It is earned in the daily battle against the illusions of the ego. And it is precisely this freedom that leads us to the next stage, the birth of authentic authority. A state in which you no longer need to prove who you are because you simply are. But to understand what it truly means to live in this state and why it is so rare in the modern world, we need to explore how the integrated ego behaves in contrast to the culture of performance, vanity, and external approval. This is what we will address next. We live in an era obsessed with authority, but rarely true authority. Authority today is confused with influence, followers, fame, financial success, or persuasive ability. But what Jung calls authentic authority has nothing to do with performance, control, or applause. It is a type of presence that does not need to be announced, defended, or imposed. It is the authority that arises from within, from the deep integration between the ego and the self. A person who operates from this authority no longer lives in an attempt to prove anything to anyone. They do not enter rooms trying to impress, do not despair for validation, do not react with desperation to criticism or failure. Their strength lies not in the image they project, but in the integrity with which they live. They know themselves, and more importantly, recognize themselves in what they do, in what they say, and even in what they choose not to do. Their word carries weight, not because it is loud, but because it comes from a place of internal coherence. Carl Jung describes this state as the moment when the ego ceases to be the center of the psyche and finds its rightful place within a larger psychic system. It is as if, at the end of the journey, the ego finally understands. I am not the whole, but I am an essential part in the dialogue with the whole. From there, it no longer struggles against the unconscious, against emotions, against shadows. It becomes a channel, a translator between the self, this greater psychic intelligence, and the objective world. Authentic authority is, therefore, a phenomenon that emerges naturally when the ego stops hijacking identity. It is not constructed as a public image. It does not depend on labels like coach, guru, expert, or visionary. In fact, often those who possess this authority do not even care to be seen, because they are no longer operating from the need to be approved. They are operating from the responsibility to their own truth. And this truth, it is worth saying, is not always comfortable. A person with authentic authority can be unsettling. They can speak truths that no one wants to hear. They can expose contradictions, challenge norms, break conventions. But they do not do this out of rebellion, vanity, or desire for recognition. They do it because they need to be true to themselves. Their speech is a direct expression of the self, and therefore carries power. Not because they try to convince, but because it resonates with something that is deeply human and real. It is this type of presence that changes environments, that transforms groups, that disarms conflicts, that leads without needing to dominate, that inspires without needing to promise. It is the type of presence that Jung considered a sign of advanced individuation, the visible manifestation of deep inner work. And perhaps that is why it is so rare. The modern world rewards the appearance of authority, charisma, rehearsed speech, the veneer of confidence. But it despises its real origin, which is silent, invisible, and requires a long journey of self-confrontation. For someone to reach this state, they need to have faced their shadows, integrated their complexes, deflated their ego, and finally accepted the responsibility of living aligned with the self, even if it costs status, relationships, and certainties. And this leads us to the final question. What happens when the ego finally accepts its role and submits to the self? What changes in practice? How does this reintegration transform not only their identity, but their life as a whole? In the last part of this course, we will explore this culminating moment, the reunion between ego and essence, and the birth of a life governed no longer by masks, but by real purpose. Because when the ego finds its rightful place, everything changes, and you, finally, become whole. When the ego finally stops commanding the psyche and accepts its place as a servant of the self, a silent, but radical, change occurs. The internal chaos ceases. The conflicting voices that once dominated your thoughts lose strength. The impulsive reactions that dragged you into repetitive patterns begin to dissolve. For the first time, you experience what it means to live from the center, not from the periphery of your identity. This transition is not spectacular. It does not come with fireworks, mystical revelations, or instant enlightenment. In fact, it often manifests in small, everyday gestures. A conscious silence where there would have been a reaction. A firm no where there was once submission. A decision made from internal truth, not external expectation. These small acts mark the beginning of a new phase, the phase of integrity. Jung understood that this reintegration of the ego into the self did not make someone a spiritual being in the fanciful sense of the term. On the contrary, it made someone a deeply human being, because only those who have faced their own abyss can walk in the world with their feet on the ground and their soul awake. The difference is that now choices no longer arise from fear, defense, or the need to prove oneself. They arise from a place of coherence, purpose, and alignment. Living with the ego in service of the self is walking with clarity even amidst confusion. It is feeling fear, but not being controlled by it. It is having ambitions, but not being a slave to them. It is taking responsibility without carrying guilt. It is loving without losing oneself. It is making mistakes without self-destruction. It is understanding that true strength lies not in conquering the world, but in not losing oneself. This reconciliation between ego and essence is what gives rise to authentic authority, real presence, and an existence where every gesture is congruent with who you are inside. There is no longer a need to play roles, wear masks, or hide your imperfections. Because now, you no longer need to be perfect. You just need to be whole. But this wholeness, as you have seen, requires work. It requires presence. It requires you to recognize when you are being hijacked by your complexes, to accept your shadow, to choose every day to act from the self, and not from the image the world expects. It is a lifelong task, and that is precisely why it is worth it. Because when the ego finds its rightful place, you stop surviving and finally begin to live. If this video confronted you, great. That means your ego has been poked and perhaps is ready to change its place. Now, I want to know from you, at what moment in your life did you realize that it was no longer you who was in control? Share in the comments. Your experience can help someone else see themselves too. And remember, the journey doesn't end here. The next video is an essential continuation of this process. Don't stop now, keep watching, because what comes next is important. I'll see you there.